the City of Peoria Planning and Zoning Commission. The Planning and Zoning Commission is composed of volunteer citizens appointed by the City Council. The Commission is the designated hearing body for a range of land use applications, including general plan amendments, rezones, conditional use permits, and amendments to the zoning code. Upon recommendation by the Commission, general plan amendments, rezones, and zoning code amendments proceed forward to the Peoria City Council for final action. For conditional use permits, the Commission will make a final decision subject to appeal. All hearings are conducted in accordance with the rules for procedure requirements to allow an impartial and efficient hearing, and all Commission meetings are open to the public under the Arizona Open Meeting Law. It appears on the agenda unless otherwise announced during the meeting. Once called, City staff will give a presentation of the case, followed by a presentation from the applicant if they so desire. After the applicant's presentation, members of the public who have submitted a speaker's request form will be called to speak by the Commission Chair. The applicant may be called to provide additional information, clarification, or a rebuttal. The Commission will discuss the case, may ask additional questions, and take action. Any member of the public wishing to speak must complete a speaker's request form and hand it to the planning assistant at the end of the dais. When speaking, please limit your comments to a maximum of 3 minutes and try not to repeat statements already made by others. We welcome your comments, and as fellow citizens of Peoria, we thank you in advance for your participation.
To the November 14th, 2024 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for City of Peoria. Thank you all for being here. Everyone in the crowd, thank you. We'll do a quick roll call. Chair Fighter is present. Vice Chair Waitman Powell is not. Secretary Nelson?
Present.
Commissioner Cottrell?
Present.
Commissioner Konkowski?
I'm here.
Commissioner Myers is not present. Commissioner Villasenor?
Here.
Great, thank you. I'll use this moment to do the final call for speaker request forms. I have none as of now, so we will close that. First item on the agenda is a consent agenda. We'll enact with one motion. Commission, do I have a motion on the consent?
Chairman, I move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a first and a second. Commissioners, please vote. And the motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Moving on fairly rapidly here tonight. Regular agenda, new business. Staff will start with item 3R, Code Amendment, Administrative and Procedures, TA 24-01. Are we going to do it one at a time or, okay.
Chair, members of commission, yes, tonight
Thank you.
is recommendation, so there are 3 presentations, 3 actions on the code amendments that we keep talking about, but tonight is the finale. So with that, let's roll. First one is TA 2401. This is the Administration and Procedures Text Amendment. This was initiated in response to the Senate bill requirements of SB 1162, otherwise known as the shot clock. Couple other things, we decided to go big or go home, but we're going big on this one. We're, in addition to responding to the legislative requirements, we are restructuring the code for improved longevity and adaptability, and in particular, improve clarity and ease of use. We touched pretty much every section within the zoning ordinance, sans definitions on this particular one, and we even added a new one, 900. The reason for the changes, 2-part. First, in response to the legislative items, Peoria meets and exceeds the shot clock requirements of SB 1162, and I'll touch on that on the next slide. The code is being updated to reflect the city's enhanced administration procedures. So basically, we're solidifying our policies as they are now. This is also opportunity to improve the code in preparation for future improvements. So when we need to go back in and do some tinkering, we have the ability to do so. So as a refresher for those at home, SB 1162 was a 2-part requirement, but the one in particular from a rezoning standpoint touched on processing deadlines. The first one is administrative completeness, and it required first submittal determination within 30 days, a resubmittal determination within 15 days. Our current average is 2 days. It will extend up to 5 days maximum during holidays and weekends. However, our policy is a 14-day administrative completeness requirement, and that's what's codified in the draft that you have before you this evening. The second piece of the shot clock bill required approval or denial decision within 180 days. It was limited to non-PAD and PCD amendments. So in this case, it would be like a initial zoning request and straight zoning. So a city-adopted zoning case other than PAD and PCD. We have very few of those. In the bill itself, there were certain allowances for extensions, but it did not address the resubmittal timeframe, the 180 days. It did not also allow an organic resolution to issues. With that said, there was little impact to the Peoria code because we process a low number of standard rezoning cases to begin with, and those are typically under 180 days anyways. So we would meet the requirements outlined within the bill. Just as a reminder, our state statutory notice when we do rezoning cases, 75 days is taken up generally for noticing and things of that nature. So out of that 180-day requirement, about 75 is taken up with statutory noticing. So in summary, what are we doing? So with regards to the SB 1162, we're adding the determination of completeness within the code. In order to be responsive, we're asking applicants to reduce the resubmittal times from 1 year to 6 months. That will actually cut down the total duration of what it would take to get a rezoning from start to finish done. What we're often finding is when we're doing our metrics, over half the time is spent by the applicant waiting to resubmit a case. It's not necessarily in city hands, it's in the applicant's hands. And so if we want to move the needle in terms of total duration for a rezoning case time, this is a level to do that. Now, there is the ability of a one-time extension. If they can't meet that 6-month resubmittal deadline, they can ask for an extension, a one-time extension. But we want them also to be successful in the case and moving forward. So that's in the code amendment. So a couple other points to make. We have a consolidation of the administration procedures. They were all over the place in multiple sections. Now it's a one and done in 21-100. We've also clarified and unified our application procedures. Again, the text was rewritten in so many forms. We've unified and standardized that language in there. And then finally, we restructured the code for ease of use and adaptability. Those are the new sections. You'll see in particular signage gets its own section now. Landscaping will have its own section. Parking has its own section. Currently, parking alone, I think, has 4 small subsections crammed into 800. So if we were to do a text amendment for parking, we would have to go indent to indent to indent to get the information to fit in the existing code. We put everything in 900, parking, much easier for the consultant. What is the parking requirements for Peoria? 900, it's very easy to find. So we think this will be a huge benefit. In terms of public outreach, seems like we've been talking about this a lot, and we have. But in terms of outreach methods, we've used the website, legal noticing, public meetings, et cetera. In terms of meetings, we did a legislative briefing to City Council in September. We introduced the bills to Commission October 3rd. We had a very lively discussion October 17th last month. And in terms of public noticing, we followed the zoning ordinance. We received no correspondence whatsoever on this particular text amendment. So our findings are the proposed code changes recognize the existing Peoria policies and practice for the duration, and they exceed the SB 1162 requirements. We're memorializing our standards into practice, which far exceed what we're being asked to do. Why are we making the additional changes with the enhancements? It's in line with our general plan policies that require us to review and update the regulatory documents on a regular basis. So these changes are directly in line with the general plan. Possible commission options are listed on the screen. And with that, staff is recommending approval of case TA 2401 to City Council as shown in Exhibit A. And with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you. Out of all these code amendments, I think this is the one that we've had the least amount of discussion on. So if anyone has any questions, if not, do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion. I'll make a motion. We recommend approval of case TA 24-01 to the City Council as proposed in Exhibit A.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Commission, please vote. And it passes unanimously. Thank you. Next item, 4R, Code Amendment, Accessory Dwelling Units and Backyard Fowl, TA 24-02. Ms. Deaver, this one I think we will have more discussion on.
As expected, Chair. So let's get started. So as a refresher, this particular code amendment request is addressing the regulatory requirements of House Bill HB 2720 and HB 2325. In addition to, we are asking for modifications to the accessory building standards and, last but not least, updating cross-references and unification of terminology. In this particular section, we're touching 200 definitions, 300 general provisions, 400 residential, and 600 PAD and PCD, because single-family residential is allowed within those as well. So the reason for the changes, in addition to the 3 legislative bills that will be going into effect January 1st, 2025, the HB 2325 backyard fowl superseded all codes, and those requirements preempted anything that the city has in the code. Because it's touching the same sections as the ADU provision, we've lined these two up. So effectively what we're doing is removing outdated code references and either citing to Chapter 16 of the Peoria City Code for animals, or we're referencing back to the state legislature the particular code requirements for the backyard fowl. So that's the simple cleanup portion. Second piece is what we call the ADU bill, or the casita bill. And in the next couple slides, I'll talk about the strict provisions that the city may and may not enact. We're also, again, asking for consideration for changes to the accessory building standards to address enforcement and compliance concerns if we have uneven standards. So with that, let's do a refresher. What is an accessory dwelling unit? The 3 criteria that the state outlined deal with the inside of the facilities themselves. It is a self-contained living unit on a single-family lot. There's a separate entrance, sleeping area, kitchen, and sanitation facilities. And these may be either attached or detached from the main house. We believe there's going to be a moderate impact on Peoria. ADUs must be allowed in all single-family zoning districts with limited exceptions. And the law also goes into limiting the city's ability to address impacts to adjoining properties, as we've talked about before. However, in the reading of the bill, we do believe it allows a restrictive covenant between private properties. And what does that mean? It appears the HOAs within their CC&Rs can preempt state regulations to address ADUs. So in terms of requirements, all single-family lots will be required up to 1 detached and 1 attached ADU. Examples are provided on the right. If you have a lot greater than 1 acre in size, a 3rd ADU would be allowed if it was restricted affordable, and there's the definition within there, and that's encapsulated within the draft code. That would be allowed with a deed restriction or development agreement in place. The bill goes on further and outlines the size of the ADUs. As you see, it's either 75% of the house gross floor area or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. Not to be outdone, we have additional regulations that we may not regulate or require the ADU. In particular, we cannot ask them to require fire sprinklers. There's no more restrictive regulations for building height, lot coverage, et cetera. The side and rear setbacks are set at 5 feet max. No additional parking or in lieu can be requested to offset these, to mitigate the ADU. We would not be able to match the design or finish of the house. We're no longer able to regulate any family relationship between the owner and occupant. So as you can see on the screen, there's a number of things that the city may not do or require. We did have a couple of policy considerations that we did talk about. The first one, the bill does allow possible exclusion within a vicinity of a military airport. So what we see on the screen is the graphic of Southern Peoria Avenue. The red, orange, and yellow are the APZ zones for Luke Air Force Base. The kind of squiggly lines are the noise contours, and the blue kind of boundary that looks like a half diamond between extending from Bell Road to Northern Avenue is what we call the vicinity of a military airport. Given the impact of what this would do, staff did not make the recommendation to include this provision within the code. Other policy considerations we talked about. Should the owner of a short-term rental reside on the property if it contains an ADU? One suggestion, an additional suggestion, was to restrict the occupancy to no more than 2 persons. Based on our existing policies and practices and our ability to enforce these provisions, staff felt it didn't move the needle any more than what we had in place, and so we did not include this within the code. So let's get to the one provision area that we had the most discussion on. ADUs and accessory buildings. So the focus of the bill was on the internal components to make the space habitable. So an ADU is focused on habitable space of these accessory buildings. From the exterior, there's no discernible difference between an ADU and the majority of typical accessory buildings, meaning from a code enforcement standpoint, you would not be able to take a visual glance and determine if they had an ADU inside or not. If we were to leave the existing accessory building standards in place, it creates a mismatched setback and height requirements. So Commission has identified there is concerns if we were to align the accessory building standards with the ADU requirements, meaning to allow the garages, sheds, et cetera, to have a maximum 5 feet from the rear, 5 feet from the side, et cetera. So based on those comments, 2 options were provided in the code. Option number 1, which is recommending to align the ADU and the accessory building standards together. Option number 2 within your packet is to address the legislative requirements and add the ADU development standards in the code. However, maintain or keep in place the multi-tier building and height standards that we have in place for the other accessory building standards. So you have option 1 and option 2. Both meet the legislative intent and would satisfy the code requirements. One addresses some of staff's concerns. So if Commission selects option number 2, some of the things that we put into the packet in terms of challenges that we will face. Within the bill and within the building code, kitchen is not a defined term. So it doesn't mean that you have to have a certain number of appliances. It doesn't mean you require a stove, doesn't mean you require a cooktop. So could somebody ask us, hey, does a microwave and a hot plate count? The answer could be yes, from a building code standpoint. If you go further, the building code doesn't say you have to have any appliances in there, really. You could just simply have your plumbing, your cabinets, couple of outlets, and would it meet? Yes, you have provided a cooking area, and it would meet and satisfy that requirement. So in absence of a defensible definition, either in the legislative bill or within the building code, the vast number of accessory buildings that we looked at in that slideshow last time could easily apply and meet the ADU criteria. The other consideration that from a code enforcement standpoint, when you don't have a detectable or appreciable exterior difference, the question is always asked from a staff perspective, what is the compelling government interest in requiring a larger setback for a lesser intense use? Because you have the ADU, theoretically you have a more intense use, and yet you have a less restrictive setback than what you're requiring for something that would not necessarily have occupants within it. So what is the overarching governmental interest in requiring much greater setbacks for a lesser intense use? And from a staff perspective, we find there's no good answer for that. One of the other mandates when we're administrating the code is the zoning code mandates that the zoning administrator and the code enforcement official has to fairly and equitably apply the code correctly. So if you were to leave the code as is, there is high probability for unequal application because of the number of things in place, the number of variables. We would have to satisfy, what is a kitchen? What is a sleeping area? Does your futon qualify as a sleeping area? It's possible. Does a Murphy bed qualify as a sleeping area? It's possible. Again, we don't have defensible terms in place to satisfy those requirements. So at the end of the day, we understand we have a loophole right now, and if we don't address it by aligning the standards and the setbacks, it would open up the city for potential litigation and liability very quickly. So that is why we're asking for the opportunity to make that alignment. So again, we've talked about this, and we'll go through and answer questions. I'm not going to belabor our methodology. It's the same as before. What I will note is the examples provided tonight and the examples that were provided in the packet are similar questions that we've already had from residents since the bill has been adopted. In particular, one individual wanted to know if he put a hot plate on the counter, could he go through this process before the bill was in place? If he put the hot plate below the counter and made it a permanent fixture, does that count, and is that partly a kitchen? So we have already started to answer some of these gyrations of questions. So these are legitimate things that we would have to address. In key findings, both options address and comply with the exemptions, pre-exemptions within the code, within the legislative requirements. So as such, both of those options meet our legislative mandate. Where the regulations and provisions associated with the ADUs are mandated without exception or allowance, staff believes the code is in compliance with those requirements. So all in all, you have a choice before you this evening. So staff has provided two options for consideration. This is different. So option A, you can approve option number 1 as recommended by staff. And that is aligning the ADU and the accessory building setbacks together. Option number 2 is addressing the ADU requirements solely and maintaining the existing multi-tier system for accessory buildings in place. If you don't like that, you can choose option C, which is select either 1 or 2 and start making modifications. You can deny both, which means the mandate goes into effect for ADUs regardless come January 1st, or we continue an action to a date certain. So with that, staff is recommending approval of the case as shown in option 1, Exhibit A. So with that, I'll take questions.
Ms. Deaver, you raised an interesting question that I found interesting, was why would we be more restrictive to accessory structures than ADUs? Where my heart is, the state's forcing us to be less restrictive on the ADUs, not on the accessory structures. So that would kind of be my thought, is we're being forced to loosen this code here. We don't want to loosen it for the other structures. That's not required. Could the differentiation between ADU and accessory structure be that it's conditioned space and it is inhabitable? Like it's not like a garage that doesn't have AC. I mean, ignore the hot plate scenario and just say if it's got AC and it's cooled and it's occupiable space, then that's an accessory dwelling unit.
Chair, it is an interesting question. What I would surmise is if it meets the criteria outlined by the state for an ADU, how can staff not call it an ADU? Regardless of whether it was in a garage structure or not, because we do have existing habitable space within RV structures, within garage things, within garages and items now, within pool structures as well. So there are existing buildings out there because we don't have defensible positions for a kitchen and a sleeping area. Come January 1st, they could qualify as an ADU based on the criteria set by the state.
Commissioner Villaseñor?
Thank you. Thank you, staff. You're probably exhausted with this topic, so I don't tend to talk longer than I need to. But I have a couple questions. Real quick, can you go back to the first slide, or it might have been slide 2. This one. Okay, so what is an accessory dwelling unit? You have the separate entrance, comma, sleeping area, comma, kitchen, comma, and sanitation facilities. So it is not and or, it's and. They need to have all these. That seems to me not that ambiguous as far as, for instance, a garage is not going to have a sanitation facility. It may have a counter with a hot plate on it, so that would serve as an area where you prepare meals, which is the Oxford definition of a kitchen, because I get where staff is coming from. And I'm thinking through how can the city avoid potential liabilities or unfair treatment. But is that the true, I mean, should it be and or is it and? So all those components must be there.
Chair, Commissioner, all of those components need to be there. What we often find in especially larger accessory buildings, garages, they don't want to walk to the main house to do a lot of things. So there will be a bathroom in there. There will be a cabinet, kitchen area, an area to have stuff in. We often find more and more that especially the big, large garages on larger lots will have some couches or whatever. It might be, and it's typically defined as a living room, but it has all of the components that would make it an ADU. And so,
And I would think in that case, then it's an ADU, I mean, to protect the city. You know, my suggestion might be if you know, the body here does decide to go with option 2, the city is liberal in their definitions to avoid any kind of issues on that. But let me move to my next question. So I agree completely with what you're saying in terms of, you know, the unintended consequences or the unknown true definitions or interpretations of this. My assumption is that there will be amendments made to this at the state in the coming session. Have you had conversations with the Government Relations Department in terms of what other cities are doing? I would imagine all cities are struggling with this, which is my second piece to the question. What are some of your peers doing in other municipalities in the Valley?
Commissioners, from what we have heard, multiple cities are taking different routes. There are some who are more impacted by short-term rental that are trying to add as many provisions as possible to ratchet down the ability to do some of this. There are other cities that have already allowed ADUs, and they're modifying those standards accordingly. So there is a mixed bag across the valley in terms of the approaches being taken right now. And for us, in consideration of the bill requirements, likely with HOAs, they're going to take a stand one way or the other, and we're going to still have questions where, can you do this within the city? Yes, but please ask your HOA first, and it's still going to be a tug of war in that conversation. But where we have the ability to address ADUs, we also want to be equitable to those buildings that time and time again, we're consistently seeing the components of an ADU that will be easily converted to an ADU. The other consideration and the flip of the conversation is if a building is constructed and has an ADU in it, but they decide for whatever reason they want to take those components out, the building becomes legal non-conforming because it's a lesser use. So if something happens to the structure, they lost their rights to do modifications to that building because now it's a legal grandfathered but non-conforming structure. And so, but what has changed really is something on the inside that you don't really see. So why does that necessitate a 5-foot additional setback because of it? So there's things to play into that conversation.
And I understand the challenges there will be to enforce this. I'm certainly taking that into consideration. Some of my other questions in terms of your presentation is, why would you not restrict it to 2 people maximum? Can you explain that to me? Like, if we have the ability to do that, why would we not do that?
Chair, Commissioners, it was a good question, and I believe we got into, let me see if I can paraphrase. The question was, it was a Socratic question, a question with a question, if you will. What happens if I'm having my child on the title of the home and they are renting out the ADU? Is the child responsible? Do they meet the definition of owner? What if I'm having my child there, but I'm the owner and I'm not living there? What happens in that case? So we were
Excuse
talking
my
about
interruption, is it owner or tenant? I mean,
So owner, think about the main house. Who is the owner? So if you were to share ownership of the deed on there, who truly is an owner in that case? So if you have a college-age kid and you're trying to get them established with credit or whatever, and you're sharing ownership, what is the definition of owner? So putting that aside, what also came up from the code enforcement perspective is, number one, you have to be asked onto the property in order to see if there is a code issue to begin with. 9 times out of 10, we're not going to be invited onto the property. How do we determine if there's 2 or more persons? There's a whole laundry list of reasons why it's going to be hard to move the needle for an enforcement perspective. So our code enforcement division, our department, recommended we not go that forward. What we have in place in terms of registration for short-term rental is effective, but even with a volunteer, with no fee whatsoever, we are only into a limited percentage of people signing on and doing it.
yeah, and again, I can appreciate the enforcement piece, but by not putting that restriction in, we're not protecting our residents against someone moving in their neighbor's yard, and there's 8 people back there, and they can hear them, they can take pictures of them, they can see them, there can be proof materialized that there is more than 2 people there. That would at least give the city teeth to do any type of enforcement. I guess I'm not in favor of putting unnecessary restrictions on something. I get that we may not be able to enforce this to the way maybe all residents would like us to enforce this, but there's also some protection in putting that in, and that's something I would be mindful of. I also would, encourage everyone to be mindful that we should make rules to, or make policy to the rule, not the exceptions. I understand I could buy a house with my child, and there could be that confusion, but that might be the exception, not the rule, and I would just encourage us. One other question I have is, why would we not exclude the military area? Because again, why not put those protections in place? And obviously, a big piece for me is just to preserve the beauty of Peoria and our open space and our home values and everything else. I am not against ADUs at all. But I think some of these things, I don't know why we would go above and beyond what's being asked of us. And before you answer that question, because then I'll be done, Tony, is I am curious, and I don't know that it was answered, does the Government Relations Department of the City of Peoria feel that there will be changes or amendments made in the coming session? Because if there's that possibility, which I highly think there will be, we should use caution in doing too much, because it's hard to take something away. It's much easier to put something on than it is to take it away. And so I would like my answer to the question on the government relations, and I'm done. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, if I may, I'll ask Lori to answer the military airport one, but before we go there, I wanted to go back to your initial question, and that was on the number of persons. In our reading of the bill, now this was a working group suggestion, but I'll tell you, nowhere in the bill does it imply within the enabling authority that we have any ability to regulate the number of persons within that. Our reading of the bill is that that's probably an overreach. It doesn't provide any type of suggestion that we can do that within the bill. And so I'm at odds to see how a working group could even suggest that type of restriction within the bill.
So you mean someone suggested it, but we're not allowed to do that per the state statute? Did I misunderstand?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, when you look at the bill that was passed, there is nothing in the bill that remotely enables or suggests any type of authority on the behalf of the city to restrict the number of persons within that ADU. So that's why we didn't take that tack, because we just don't see that authority there on that piece. And then I'll have Lori address the military report. On the third piece, the Government Affairs Office, we haven't received any indication that there will be any adjustments or amendments. I think as all the cities are quickly grappling with these and trying to understand these standards and put these into place very quickly, there wasn't a lot of time afforded to all the jurisdictions. There certainly are questions that are arising, and that may come up. I just haven't heard yet, if that's, yeah.
Thank you. Secretary Nelson?
Thank you. Some of my questions were answered, but I did have a couple of others.
There was one more question that she was going to answer.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
On the
Okay.
military zone, why are we choosing to restrict?
Sorry, Ms. Diva. The floor is yours.
So, Chair, Commissioners, so a couple of different things. If we are sincere trying to advance housing, having an additional restriction, and in particular in an area where ADUs might be well received, seems to go against the intent of the legislation.
Thank you.
I could add more if you
No, I
wish,
think that's,
but
I just wanted to understand the thinking. I really did. So I agree. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Nelson?
Secretary Nelson?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I had the same exact question. I'm a bit resentful that, I'm beating a dead horse here, I know, but that the state is requiring us to do this. And I'm still of the mindset that I'm not going to give them any more than they require. But that's just my feeling on it. And I know it creates some headaches for enforcement. I certainly appreciate that and hear that, but that's kind of where I stand. I was curious, a question I had was on the kitchen, the bathroom. I think we called it was sanitation, something, nothing but I assume we're talking about bathroom, sleeping area. It's not well defined, it sounds like, within the statute. But do we have the ability, does the state give deference to the localities like Peoria to better define what that is to us?
So I will go back to the one slide with the ADU components. So I will paraphrase this, and I will look to Chris to enhance the conversation. A zoning administrator regulates provisions of the zoning code, and within it, we talk land uses, building setbacks, et cetera. When you get into defining what a kitchen, sanitation, sleeping area, entrance is, that's not a zoning ordinance requirement. That is a building code or a fire code requirement. And so the zoning administrator would be exceeding their authority if they're starting to really evolve into that area and step outside the traditional definition of what you can regulate within a zoning code perspective. So let's go further. When we talk regulations within developments, within a C2, we have certain uses. We talk operational restrictions. We'll talk about height, setbacks, et cetera. When we talk residences, we'll talk housing types generally, but not specifically. We don't tell you it has to be fee simple, or it has to be shared space, or it can be rental space. That's why when we talk housing and residential product, we're very broad in the conversation. But when you're talking about things about separate entrance, sleeping area, kitchen, sanitation facilities, you're really in the building code realm. You're in the plumbing, or you're in the electrical code, you're in a different kind of bailiwick outside of a zoning code realm. So it would be challenging for a zoning administrator to start defining an area where a building code official normally defines those things. And the building code is very silent. It talks about things generally, but it doesn't talk about things specifically to define these terms. So if we were, let me give you an example. If we were to have an unclear term and it's defined in the zoning ordinance, or it's called out in the zoning ordinance, if it's not in our definition, we will often use a dictionary, or things that, a normal thing that we would look to. Well, if we're talking about a kitchen, that's in the building code. What is a dwelling unit? What is cooking facilities? Those things, those terms are normally found in the building code. They're not in the zoning ordinance. So we would be playing in a different area outside the provisions of the zoning ordinance if we were to go and define those items more particularly.
So just as a follow-up, so could we look at kind of a two-phase thing here where we're also looking at the building code and maybe adding some stricter definitions to what defines a kitchen? A built-in oven, for example, or a stove, or separate sleeping quarters for, that's what I'm just trying to get at. I'm trying to figure out how we can better make this easier to enforce and easier to define, because I'm just a little bit of a philosophical thing here. The intent of this was very noble by the state, provide more housing, affordable housing. I get that. But as the questions you're getting, you can already see people who want to build garages without the same restrictions that are currently exist are going to try to leverage this to build that. And I'm trying to figure out how can we, and that's why I'm taking a little bit harder line on I'm going with option 2.
So Chair and Commissioner, in anticipation for this possible question, I asked the building official what do they have available? We're on the 2018 version of the code. We are always a little bit further back. He went into the most recent adopted 2024 version, and they very specifically continue to not get specific on the definitions of cooking, sanitation, et cetera. What they do have is kind of policy set of guidelines off to the side that everybody kind of kibitz on. And in those, there's long thoughts and feelings about what the intent of the code is, but none of it is getting codified, and that is very specific. They don't want to get into that level of definition within the actual building code themselves. And to go further, I actually asked him, and he was kind enough to provide me a couple of things. It gets into, what do you define it, the requirements of a dwelling unit? Is it a sleeping unit? Is it a guest quarter? And they have certain definitions and certain requirements for each of those. And depending on what you have inside, there's different building code requirements, but it does not go into specificity in terms of appliances and things of that nature.
Commissioner Cottrell?
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation again, Ms. Tabor. I had two kind of just general categories. One was in response to the number of persons. Is there anywhere in our zoning code right now where we're, for any district that says in this zoning we can only have 1 or 2 or 3 or 10, is there any reference to persons, number of persons restrictions in there right now?
I'm going to look to the gentleman who knows the definition of family. Oh, so well, Mr. Gleason.
They just send questions to me when it's the not fun stuff. So, Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, so we have a definition of family, and right now that definition of family is identified as 10 or fewer persons within a facility. One of the amendments that we would be looking at would codify that to 4, but that's for unrelated persons. And the distinction there is if you have, so if my family, my wife and I, I can't manage my time well enough to have 10 kids, but if we had 10 kids and we were living in a unit, it wouldn't matter that we're over that number of 10 or 4. The fact that we are related by a familial status would mean that there's no limit to our number of persons in the unit. As far as unrelated persons, that's where we're able to draw that distinction for the definition of family.
So if there's definition of family, is there a zoning group that says you're only allowed one family in this residence, thereby putting a number restriction on a residence?
Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, we have the number of dwelling units, but there's nothing specific in the zoning ordinance that states you can only have one family in a particular dwelling unit.
And that's what I'm trying to get to. So at this point, we don't have any teeth in any district that says, hey, you can only have so many people for whatever reason, however you define it, in a residence and in some type of zone.
Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, the only time that we limit the number of persons if it is not, if the principal use is not as a single-family home.
Okay.
So a slight tangent or a distinction to that would be in the case of a group home, where that facility has a limit on the number of persons, and that's where we utilize that distinction of family the most, is for those unrelated persons that are living in that residence.
Thank you. The second area is with, it seems like an incredibly powerful loophole is the HOA loophole. And if I'm understanding this correctly, if your interpretation, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if there's an HOA, CC&Rs in place that have restrictions that say no structures within 10 feet, no structures over something smaller than what we're proposing, that would supersede this, and that ADU would not be able to be built there. So that's one question. Does the HOA and the CC&Rs have that authority to supersede this? Two, does that also apply, we've always talked about setback height. Does that also apply to the other components of aesthetics and parking? Can the CC&Rs say, if you have an ADU, you have to have 3 parking spaces, and it has to look like, and all these other restrictions. That's the second part of that. And then third is kind of the overarching, looking at our city map, and knowing how many subdivisions now are created. Every single one has CC&Rs. So I would assume that all of the new subdivisions in the last 30 years, 40 years, whatever it is, they all have CC&Rs. And so if that is this powerful thing that supersedes this, and those are in place, and they can update their CC&Rs without any city impact, they can just record them and they're done. This whole law that we're writing would only apply basically to the areas that don't have CC&Rs. So the older parts of town, the areas just like you were pointing out in the Air Force Base area, parts that, and it seems like that would then unevenly apply this. And so, I mean, maybe that's the question, is just get your take on feeling that, and you're shaking your head, Chris. If you could kind of provide some feedback there.
Mr. Chair and the Commissioners, Commissioner Cottrell, excuse me. That's our reading of the bill too, that it essentially recognizes that if you have that private agreement in place, that CC&R in place, that it effectively allows you to make those, to put those rules in place, or to not be in line with this bill. So you can have parking requirements on your street, you can have design requirements as part of that contractual agreement. So it does put those in place, and you're right. A lot of the new areas have CC&Rs that may already prohibit ADUs. They can certainly amend them. And the older areas is where this possibility would apply, where you could potentially have an ADU. You're right, there is a disconnect or a disjointed nature of the bill, the way it would apply to our city.
My mic up. I know you're not going to have a number, but percentage-wise, I'm trying to think, how does this apply to the city? Out of the actual housing units that would, single-family home areas, are we at 2/3, 3/4 that have CC&Rs? Is it that big a percentage?
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, thinking back to the days when we had neighborhood services within our department, they would go into areas without HOAs and help with neighborhood pride events. And usually those neighborhoods were all south of, I want to say, Greenway particularly. So you're right, neighborhoods that were built typically beyond the late 80s and forward, they all had HOAs, yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Konkowski?
Thank you, and so glad to be back around the table for this lively discussion. I did watch last week, so I was up to speed on as much as I could be. But we are talking mostly about setbacks, right? Is that where we're landing on this? So a question, when an ADU is going to be put in, it has plumbing, sewer, electrical. Does that have to be permitted?
Chair, Commissioner, yes. And actually, we do have a number of ADUs that would meet the definition now. And we have a number of builders that have next-gen or multi-gen housing product out there that have continued to tiptoe and have gone all the way to now having ADUs within parts of Peoria. So we do have it in certain areas already existing. We have seen an uptick, I would say, in the last, at least in my mind, the last 3 to 5 years in the number of larger garage structures in the back, because they like the casita within the RV. They want to do something similar, so they do the giant garage in the back with the living room and area and the whole thing within the back of the garages. So more and more, we're seeing more buildings, more fully self-sufficient, contained, these type of things within these buildings. But we've already got ADUs in place in a fair number of communities up north as well.
So an ADU gets zero setback, is that what I understand?
Chair, Commissioner, it would be maximum of 5 feet from the side and rear. The height of these would go the same as single family, and in our zoning districts, it would be maximum of 30 feet tall for height, for building height.
Sorry for my ignorance here, but I understood we're trying to make our auxiliary unit, or the auxiliary buildings the same as the ADU requirement, which is it a 0 setback from the fence?
So, Chair, Commissioners, and it's been a minute, so I'm going to try to recite this from memory, which is usually going to get me into trouble. But right now, we have 3 tiers in the code. If you are under 8 feet and under 200 square feet, you have 0 setback right now. If you have 8 to 9 feet in height and 200 square feet, yeah, and 200 square feet, then it's 200 to 300 square feet. Yes, it's not mathematically correct. Then you have a 5-foot setback. 3-foot setback, yes. Yeah, I told you it's been a hot minute, and I have to have the sheet in front of me. Once you go above 9 feet and over 300 square feet, your setback goes to the principal building. So again, it would be 5 feet side, and it would be 15 or 20 feet, depending on what you have for the district for a rear yard setback. So in all, really the difference is the rear yard setback that we're talking about, and whether you're going to have a building that's under 8 feet. Right now, you could have it at the property line. So you can already have some of these buildings, and you'll see some of these buildings at the property line now. It really is that 8 to 9 foot differential and a slightly different size requirement. And the real difference is the rear yard setback requirement.
So, again, I'm looking at this. If they have to have a building permit, they would be an ADU, right? It wouldn't be a shed. So if a neighbor put a shed that's 9 feet high right up next to my fence, I could call and say, does he have a permit? And if it's a no, it can't be an ADU, correct? I mean, that'd be fairly easy to determine, or am I wrong?
My reminder is questioning me. So Chair and Commissioner, once it's above 200 square feet, then a building permit is required. If you have electrical being installed, a permit would be required. Most of the time, these larger buildings are going through the permitting process with these components in place. And what we're having to do now is some really wonky maneuvering to say, it's not an ADU now. For example, we used to say, well, you can't have a 220 to plug in an appliance. Well, what's the restriction now? Because you can plug in a hot plate and a microwave, and you can still have a livable unit. So we did wonky stuff like that. Or, hey, you're not going to be having an additional family in here, right? And we'd have to have a letter from the owner acknowledging, yes, we're not selling this out. So we've had a number of workarounds already, but more and more we're seeing these go into more accessory buildings during the permitting process. And we even asked the question as we were working through the code, what is the likelihood of some of these buildings being converted? And the building official is saying, there's a lot of them being converted. They're going back in, extending it, or they're adding just a few things and it would qualify. So it doesn't have to be 8 foot tall, because I was like, yeah, what if we make these 8 foot tall? He goes, the door jamb and everything, these buildings can be slightly less and still make it work. He goes, there's nothing defensible for us to hang our hat on. A lot of these buildings can get converted.
So the Commissioner Nelson point, it seems easy to identify if someone's spending the money to put permitting in and all that, it's not going to be a shed, right? It's probably not going to be a shed. I mean, why can't we leave that alone with the setbacks that are currently there? And then anybody that goes through the permitting process could qualify as an ADU or not, depending on what that is. But for my neighbor just to put a shed because now the requirements are there's zero setback, and then he doesn't take care of it because it's not something he's spending a lot of money on. But if you're spending money to build a building, a garage or whatever, it's probably going to be fairly nice, and with the zero setbacks now on a lot of lot lines are zero. That's my opinion. When I was listening to last week, I thought, why not, if it has to be permitted, okay, there's one hurdle at least that says that you can build up next to the, zero setback. But if it's not permitted, I know there's an enforcement thing there, but it seems fairly simple. Permit, yes, no permit, and they put it up next to the fence, it could be enforced fairly easy. Am I wrong?
Yeah, so as Chair Commissioners, as Chris is saying, if you're below 8 feet in height and you're below 200 square feet, you don't need a permit.
That's fine.
To put it up.
That's how it is today, though.
What's up?
That's how it is today.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but what if you're 9 feet now? You're going to change it to be zero also?
So Chair Commissioners, what we're saying is on the option 2 to leave the provisions in place. So if you're under 8 feet, under 200 square feet, no permits required, you could put the building up against the side or the rear yard without setback. You can't drain the building onto the property, of course. Once you hit the 200 square feet, a building permit kicks in. And I'm remembering, in addition to the 3 tiers, there's also the planning manager exception that if your lot backs up to open space, you can do a reduction of a setback requirement either. So there are instances, once you have 200 square feet or above, in every instance where the building is 200 square feet and above, a building permit is required. Most of the time when they're running electrical, we've had a number of code issues where they're going to run it illegally, and we find out after the fact, and then a permit we can go in and see. But it goes back to the simple question of, if I can have a large garage with essentially a casita inside or an ADU inside, why does that building with the ADU have a much less setback if it doesn't qualify for an ADU? What is the overriding interest in having a non-kitchen area push back further into the site?
So again, just to clarify, which I'm still seeing, if it's under 200 square feet, what stops me, and it's 9 foot high, what stops me from putting it up next to the wall, other than from a code enforcement standpoint? How do they know?
So Mr. Chair and Commissioner Konkowski, so as Lori was speaking to, there's 3 tiers today.
Yeah.
So you could have a building that is between 8 and 9 feet, right? Still under 200 square feet, don't need a permit, but our code requires a 3-foot setback. So it's where you are over 9 feet and over 300 square feet, so it jumps from 200 to 300, or 300 square feet, then you need a 5-foot setback. So that's one of the things we've tried to solve, is it's a little convoluted now, and
So my bad, I thought you were trying to combine those codes into one code for an enforcement standpoint.
They are.
That's what okay.
He's telling you what it is like today.
yeah, that's what it is today.
Okay,
And
okay,
earlier
yeah.
in the year, we had that discussion, but when this bill came out and forced action on the accessory dwelling unit, the thought was, if we can no longer require more than a 5-foot setback for an ADU, for an accessory dwelling unit, and there's a number of other provisions that we can have no voice on, to Lori's point, it begged the question then, because the state brought up that scenario for us to resolve. What is the difference between accessory structure and an accessory dwelling unit, if really the only distinguishing characteristics are what's inside of it? So that's what
Or it
prompted this
hasn't been
question.
permitted. But has it been permitted? Because it can't be, how could it be an ADU and not pull a permit, correct?
Yes, all the ADUs would have to get a
So
permit.
if it doesn't, so if I'm looking at my neighbor's and he's building something,
Mm-hmm.
I could call the city and ask if he has a permit for that, if he's putting it right up next to my fence, and if that was no, that would be easily enforceable?
But again, accessory structures, though, you know, depending on the height of it,
No, it's 9 feet.
size might require a permit or not, right?
Yeah.
But you're right, ADUs, because they're going to have plumbing, they have to have plumbing, and they're going to have, they're going to require a permit for that.
We're talking about enforcement, right?
Yeah.
Is that what we're landing on? Easy enforcement? Permit, ADU, zero setback, no permit, accessory building. Setbacks apply, but if we just remove that, then we're removing it. on the-
Chair, Commissioner, I just wanted to clarify. So code, for option number 1, it would establish the setbacks for the side and the rear to be maximum of 5 feet. That would unify whether it was an ADU or a non-ADU structure. The option 2, that is an ADU, again, we're set at a maximum of 5 and 5, but the same building without the kitchen, sanitation, et cetera. Now we have to look at the height, the size to determine the setback. And more often than not, those type of buildings would have to meet the principal building setback, which is 5-foot side and 15, 20 feet on the rear. So it really is the differential, and let me ask the question this way. Why does the absence of a kitchen and a bathroom facility within the same building warrant 10 additional feet setback from the rear property line?
Thank you. You good?
Again, I go back to that type of building you're describing would have a permit to it. And the type of building I'm describing would not have a permit to it if it was just a big shed and my neighbor, I'm looking for protection on that shed versus the building being built with a permit.
Chair, Commissioner Kunkowski, just as a point of clarification, so in the scenario of a large shed or an RV garage, anytime it's over 200 square feet, regardless, it would require a permit, even if it's not an ADU. So in both circumstances there, a permit would be required, whether it's over 200 square feet or if it has utilities running to it, even if it's not an ADU. So I just wanted to give some
And I
additional
under-
context
I
there.
continue to understand that. I'm just looking at the 10 by 10. That's fairly tall. These 10 by 10s are 9 feet. And they push it up next to my fence line. That's illegal, correct?
Chair, Commissioner Kunkowski, no, they would have to be 3 foot, or I'm sorry, if you're at 10 feet, you would have to meet the principal building setbacks today. So it would be illegal? Correct, if it's pushed up against to the property
Are
line.
you changing it so it would be legal? Is that what we're changing? We're changing it so that would be legal?
That would be option 1.
We would be saying that it's 5 feet from the side and 5 feet from the rear with the proposed option 1 amendment.
Yeah. Option 1 is treating accessory dwelling units and accessory structures the
It's the
same.
With 5 feet setback?
Right. Option 2 leaves
Option 2 is
accessory
more
structures the way it is
restrictive.
now.
Option 1 is less restrictive.
Well, Okay. I read it was a 5-foot setback, but then I keep hearing 0 setback on the.
Yeah.
Good.
Chair,
I'm confused.
Commissioners, I want to clarify 2 things. There is a 0 setback when it's under 8 feet.
Okay.
And under 200 square feet, and the building permit is not required
Today.
today. I want to also clarify that the current code is more restrictive when you have a larger building than what you would have when the bill provisions kick in. So the ADU would be more lenient in the setbacks, and a lesser intense use would have more restrictive setbacks. If we just address the ADU conversation and not address the accessory building conversation. So I just wanted to clarify those 2 pieces.
Yeah, and I apologize. I missed some of this, but I thought I read enough of it. So both of what option 1 is to put the 5-foot setback on everything, except under 8 foot. on any building, any size? Forget about the
Yeah, I
permit.
understand where you're, yes, so if it's under 8 feet, option number 1 says we're not going to see it, it can go reduced. But the same building, 8 feet and above, which most of these are, I know very few that aren't, will be treated the same at 5 and 5.
5 and 5 instead of 3. You were saying if it was this height.
Correct.
so
There's a
actually
3
moving it back a
option,
little bit.
yes.
Okay.
Secretary Nelson?
And just to clarify, we're talking not just garages, we're talking gazebos, we're talking ramadas, we're talking storage sheds. And we're also, by going with option 1, saying, hey, those things, they don't have to be the same color as your house. Hey, those things don't have to be the same design as your house. Isn't that wonderful? So another reason, to me, I think option 2 still, despite the headaches it's going to cause for enforcement, and I know it will, and I feel, I'm not the one out there hitting the streets having to enforce, so I get that, but I think we're giving up so much by going with option 1, and, But anyway, thank you.
Commissioner Villaseñor?
Thank you. It's just my closing argument. I just keep going back to, we are certainly grappling with this. I think these are all such great questions. It can get really confusing. I'm confident that Paradise Valley is fighting this, Scottsdale's going to fight this, Fountain Hills is going to fight this. I mean, these communities are not going to sit back, and I just think like a lot of policy that comes through the state, once it's applied on us who have to then enforce it, which is really why we're even talking about making such compromises, is we're trying to be realistic to the service we can provide. I get it. I would encourage us to just be patient, do what we have to do. I believe this will be back in front of us, unfortunately, when this, there's a group of leaders that take this on at the state level and start coloring in between the lines and gives us clarity so that we can do some of these things. I just can't imagine your, colleagues out there are not in the same spot we're all in and objecting to it.
Really well stated. I feel exactly the same way.
Thank you. Commissioner Control?
Thank you, and I'm going to make everybody mad, I think, because I'm probably the one person that might be saying that having these two as a single point, because of the potential for being taken advantage of, not to mention the enforcement issues, makes more sense. And I know what you're saying, and I feel the same way. The state's pushing this. I would rather we didn't have to do any of this at all. It's removing the city's rights, and it drives me crazy. But, having a single option, otherwise what you're describing, and you put it clear, somebody's already come in and said, well, what if I have the frying pan here? Well, what if I nail the frying pan to the ceiling? Does that still count? What if, all these things, and they'll come up, and if we don't just make it simple, they will take advantage of it. And it's a moot point. They're gonna build an ADU, and then the next day they're gonna turn around and rip it out because they wanted the gazebo anyway. And so I would rather say, let's make it clear, let's make it concise, and then with the impact on the city, I'm not sure how much this is really going to impact anyway. If 2/3 of the city is going to have HOAs and this is going to be, a moot point anyway, it turns into hey, everybody that lives in these areas, this is all it's impacting, which is unfair. But I think we then say this is why we have to apply it in an even, so it's as fair as possible. So.
One last question.
I'm sorry, maybe this is going to be maybe a dumb question, but can a subdivision have CC&Rs but not a homeowners association, or are they one and the same? Could you have? You can have CC&Rs and not an HOA.
Not like a professional management company.
Correct, I get that. Okay, so I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for another lively discussion on ADUs and accessory structures. I think the horse is officially dead. We can, Commissioners?
I'd like to make a motion.
Commissioner Villaseñor, please.
If we are done with our robust discussion, I appreciate it. I would like to recommend approval of case TA 24-02 to the City Council as proposed in option 2.
Do I have a second?
A second.
Commissioners, please vote on option 2. And the motion passes 4-1. Thank you.
Can't wait to talk about it next year.
I appreciate that Chris will be presenting this at council. So
I'll never miss another meeting.
I don't know what night that is, but you'll be there. All right. Next item on the agenda, item 5R, Code Amendment, Multifamily Adaptive Reuse, TA 24-03. Take it away, Ms. Deaver.
Chair, Commissioners, we slowed down a little bit, but we're going to pick up steam on this one as well. So this is the multifamily adaptive reuse. This code amendment is response to House Bill 2297. It impacts two particular sections, as you see. HB 2297 goes into a lot of detail in terms of what the city may and may not do, and we'll go into that in the next couple of slides. But effectively, the city must allow multifamily residential development, or what we call adaptive reuse, on any commercial, office, or mixed-use buildings on more than 10% of the existing inventory of existing buildings citywide. And that's a mouthful. When we last spoke, the likely impact is probably pretty limited on this particular set of provisions, but let's do a quick recap on the bill. The city is required to do a baseline building inventory, and building wasn't really defined within the provisions of the bill, but we have to do that inventory every 10 years. We do have the ability to designate commercial or employment hubs where buildings can be excluded from the inventory, but at most, the exclusion cannot exceed 10% of the total inventory that's out there. Key provision is this cannot require a rezone, conditional use permit, or other discretionary review, which requires a public hearing process. So effectively, this conversion is allowed by right. It can happen through either a site plan review process or a tenant improvement process. There were modified standards built into the bill regarding parking, setbacks, building height, and density. The building height provisions alone, that is definitely like a twister game on that one. It's if this, or this, or this, or this. So that one is going to be fun to implement for sure. The bill was written strangely in that the city shall include the standards, but no more than. So you have to do this, but no more than this. And included in that language was the site plan review process, evidence of adequate existing public sewer, water service, compliance with the building and fire code. I'll touch on a building that is economically or functionally obsolete here in a second. And the parcel has to be between 1 and 20 acres, and there's a set aside for 20% of the units for moderate and low income households for up to 20 years. So policy considerations, we had a couple of them. First one was, do we go with the max cap of 10% of the buildings? Yes, we went to the cap of 10% as required and outlined. When you take this cap of 10% in context with the other criteria, it basically renders the number of eligible or suitable sites very limited. So taken in its totality, each of them put together, in totality, put them all together, the ability for a number of sites to be chosen or buildings to be chosen is going to be very limited. We also had the ability to exclude certain areas, the vicinity of a military airport, properties on the historic registration list, or commercial hubs. We chose 2, but not the third. And let me point out, you have in your packet, or on the dais there, a handout. I give a resident credit. He read through and identified we had a remaining bullet point in there we shouldn't have. When we opted not to do the commercial hub, that cross-reference should have been taken out. So I give props to the individual for reading it, and definitely a gold star. So that's the change, is we didn't do the commercial hub, so we had a remaining cross-reference that shouldn't have been in there. The last one on the slide is require the set aside up to 20%. Yes, we added that per state statute as is. So where commission had conversation and we added additional items based on your feedback was a building must be economically or functionally obsolete in a state of disrepair or has the 50% vacancy in gross lease area. We all recognized it was ambiguous. We chose to further define it. We talked about the property maintenance code. We talked about a couple of other things. To Commissioner Nelson's point in particular, if you're going to be looking at leasing a building, it's 18 to 24 months before you're probably going to make a call what you're going to do with the change. So we went and clarified what a state of disrepair means. As you can see, I'm not going to read it, but it's pretty specific in terms of, you know, those pieces. And then the vacancy, so the building needs to be vacant for a period of no less than 24 consecutive months. And then we added the exclusion that doesn't mean rental payments, lease payments, taxes for that. So I'm going to pause right there, and I can circle back. That's the one change to this particular provision, or those two sections, and you will find that within the definition piece of it.
I have a question.
Commissioner Villaseñor?
On vacancy shall mean a total leasable area, blah, blah, blah. But for purposes of the section, rental payments, lease payments shall not be considered as continued use. How is it vacant if they're receiving rent or lease rent payments? Wow, did I stump you? I mean, I guess I'm just trying to think through.
I'm thinking through your question, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you have an empty building that nobody is physically in working, or, you know, it's not serving a purpose for a business, but someone's paying rent on it, then isn't it occupied?
Leased, not occupied.
Leased, not
Yeah.
occupied, thank you. I guess I'm
Yeah.
just, it's something to think through. I don't know how I feel
Chair,
about it.
Commissioner, so Chair pointed it out, and that was the line of
It's considered
thinking, because I was like continued use, and I was thinking CUP criteria. It is leased, but it's not occupied in terms of when we're talking about a business operating consecutively. I mean, you have to have an operation within the building that's not necessarily just making payments, because you're just leasing the area, but
So
you're
maybe
not actually
clarification, a
using of the
building that
building.
is not occupied for a period of no less than 24 hours. Just a suggestion, because
24
that's my
months.
question.
Yep. Okay.
I will go back and clarify, is that a change that the commissioner across the board?
was making a suggestion, so, sorry. I was making a suggestion, I guess, for us to consider in the discussion, not making a motion.
I'll circle back on that one in a second. So let me, and I'll wrap up. Same outreach, like I identified, the one individual made the inquiry. So in terms of findings, we've met the code requirements. Where we've had latitude, we've added those additional items. You see the commission options and the recommendation. Now, let me circle back to the comments. If everybody is in agreement with the comment, which I think we are in agreement with the
It adds 30,
provision,
yep.
I would ask that the motion recognize the change, and we'll make the change to the code.
I have one. Commissioner Control,
Thank you. You could have gone first.
after you, sir.
I appreciate taking our comments that we had last time and putting in the 24 months. That's excellent, and this is very well done. So my question here is more, it probably is a building code question, because I went out and got in trouble and I read a study on what these conversions might look like. Some architect did a little study. If you take a commercial building that has an elevator core and bathrooms right in the middle and all this floor space with no plumbing, and you want to convert it to apartments, you either have to plumb all the way out to all of the different apartments for everybody's toilet, or you build dorm-style things that you have common kitchen and a common bathroom. And has any thought been given to, hey, we're not going to, just thinking in my head, this gets converted, all of a sudden it's dorm-style, all of a sudden that means, it affects land values of these units, it's much lower than you want for a normal apartment. Anything like that, has that been considered?
Commissioner, Chair, Commissioners, not specifically. However, I think if we add the clarifying language from the previous slide about it needing to be occupied, perhaps it addresses or blunts that consideration there. If you have to have occupied space, over 50% for 24 months.
The question maybe is not necessarily that, assuming that this is qualified, so based on your revision, this structure does meet those standards, and now the developer owner wants to come in and convert these, but he wants to do it incredibly cheaply, and he builds these little 500 square foot things with no plumbing, and all of a sudden you realize that it's turning into something different than what the city would want. I mean, is there some provision or way to do that, or am I just saying, hey, this is beyond that scope?
Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, I think you're asking more so about the form that multifamily takes. Is that correct? There's nothing contemplated right now that discusses those communal facilities like communal cooking or communal bathroom facilities with regard to the multifamily aspect of this, if that addresses your question.
So that is a potential, basically. If somebody came in and proposed that, there would be no objection from staff. I mean, it meets the code, technically.
Chair, Commissioner Cottrell, there's no prohibition against it at this time.
Add a prohibition? I mean, I think what he's trying to get, what he's concerned of is like a student housing type of a situation, or almost like a hostel, really. Yeah.
Chair, Commissioners, I'm not sure that it can be addressed within the zoning code allowances. I would think it would be more within the building code aspect. With regard to how they're defining the space, et cetera, it's not just the electrical or the plumbing, it would also be the building type. And so there could be additional fire rating and things. So depending on how they want to build and the use type, the construction type in question, the cost prohibition, it gets pretty costly when you try to convert some of these. So given where we're at with the office, et cetera, vacancy rate, which is pretty interesting within Peoria. We don't see a lot of these conversions. So it's an interesting conversation. If the building code wants to address it, we would work within the confines of the building code. There's also the fire code aspect of it, with the additional units and the height, et cetera. So with the combination all of these, we're not sure there's going to just be a lot of conversion.
So from a zoning standpoint, there is no distinction between a dorm-style residence with common facilities versus a regular apartment that each one has its own. There's no difference from the zoning standpoint.
Chair, from that standpoint, multifamily is multifamily.
Could we write that into this, that concept? That each individual unit has to have its own, like, cooking area, sanitary room, the same definition, you know, right?
Chair,
I
that
think it
was
just
not.
extended the
that was-
evening by about an hour.
To borrow from the zoning administrator, that was not an allowance that the bill allotted
Everyone
to
want to call
us.
home and they're going to be late? You get the point of my question? Is that something that we could,
Chair, I'm not sure within the confines of the bill that we would necessarily have the wherewithal to be putting that provision in there's nothing in the, so what the bill is saying is it has to be building code, it has to be fire code with certain items. We can't go through a rezoning process, we can't put a lot of restrictions on it, it has to go through site plan or a TI. When they're looking at the number of units at that point in time, they're gonna look at the construction type, they're gonna look at the plumbing and everything else. And when you go from commercial to when you change the electrical and all of that, there's a cost associated with it. So if they work within the building and the fire code, that's going to be pretty cost prohibitive depending on what they're going to want to do.
Okay. Commissioner Villaseñor?
Yes, thank you. Just a couple comments and one question. Do the 24 months start as of January 1, or someone could, like, this could go retro? I could show you that it's been vacant for 24 months as of January 1. Have we thought that part through?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I think we're putting the burden on the applicant. If they want to do a conversion, in addition to the other qualifying characteristics, they have to demonstrate that the building has been unoccupied for 24 consecutive months. So I imagine they would need to show us information. And doesn't necessarily have to be January 1st, it could be any
Okay.
period of time.
Just historically?
Correct.
Okay. I really actually like this. I'm more in favor of multifamily than I am of a bunch of ADUs and non-CCNR communities that probably need our protection. I think that, no one likes the vacant building, and there has been a shift in the commercial market since COVID with people working from home or remote working, what have you. So to me, it makes good sense to have a policy in place. Again, I still do not care that the state is forcing this on us. I would like a reminder, and I don't feel passionate about it either way, but why did we choose 24 months? Because it almost feels like it's too long.
That feels too long to me.
It almost feels too long to me, and mostly because if someone's going to make the conversion, they're going to try to hit the market. So I don't know. I'm just trying to think through what's reasonable. Again, I don't feel passionate about it either way. I just am questioning why did we pick 24 months?
Chair, Commission, the range provided was 18 and 24, and when I did the additional poll, consensus was leading closer to the 24, yes.
Thank you for the reminder.
Thank you. Any commissioners have any other questions? Do I have a motion?
Chair, I'll make a motion. I recommend, you know what? We do have we had a modification on this one, didn't we? Can we go? Do you want to make the motion? Because if you've taken,
You can.
I'll second it.
Thank you. I will make a motion, recommend approval of case TA 24-03 to the City Council as proposed in Exhibit A with one modification to the item regarding the vacancy shall mean the total leasable floor area of the building is unoccupied for a period of no less than 24 consecutive months. And the rest of it can remain the same.
Second the motion.
Commissioners, please vote. And it passes unanimously, 5-0. Thank you. Last item on the regular agenda, item 6R, project update, downtown code amendment, TA 24-04. How about it?
Chair and Commissioner, this will be short and sweet, but we figured we would give you an update because why not close out the year with yet another code amendment coming your way? So this one is for downtown Peoria. Let's just recap for the folks that may be watching online. Our goal is, and the vision for downtown is a vibrant, walkable, mixed-use area. We have a number of ongoing efforts to revitalize downtown Peoria, and this code amendment in particular is in support of that, primarily creating distinction through signage. We've got some housekeeping items and clarifying the overly ambitious naming that planners did for the district and subzones, which nobody else really cares about. And we're redefining the land uses to pull them into the modern day age. Sorry, Chris, no video stores. At the same time, we did hear from Commission and HPC that the code requirements that we're bringing forward need to be always respectful for existing residences and businesses. So we had an additional meeting. So think back, we've been in front of Commission a couple of times now, since April. We had an open house on November 7th. We had one individual in attendance. She is well-versed in our proposal, so it was more time getting caught up about things rather than discussing or presenting the code amendment itself. So with that said, we will be back before you December 5th with possible recommendation, one last code amendment to talk about. This will be then proceeding the first part of the year to City Council for consideration. And that's my update on the downtown code.
Great. Thank you so much. Any questions on that item? Okay. We will call to the public for any non-agenda items. I'll open the public meeting, and seeing that we are in not full attendance tonight, I will close the meeting. Reports from staff.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, first off, I want to thank the commission for all of the insight and discussion we've had over all of these bills. I mean, there's a lot of dizzying language, and the implications are pretty wide, and so I really appreciate your input on these. Secondly, as you can see on the schedule here, our next meeting is December 5th. But before that, we've got the holiday season that's starting up, and I just wanted to wish every one of you a very happy and very healthy Thanksgiving holiday. We've got some cards to pass out to all of you, and just welcome you, thanking for your time and attention and expertise. And I guess we'll see you on December 5th. It'll be the next meeting.
Great, thank you. Any commissions from, any comments or updates from the commission?
I have a request.
Commissioner Villaseñor?
Yes, thank you. I have a request. I don't know if it's even applicable, but would it be possible, with all of these mandates coming down from Big Brother, to maybe have a presentation from the Government Relations Department on anything that's related to land planning, planning and zoning? Are there any priorities set forth with the City of Peoria that they're going to be working on? If there's not, there's not, but I would be interested to know what the thoughts are in the coming year, especially as it relates to some of these things that are being put on us. And are there new things coming down the path? That would be a request for a future agenda item.
That sounds like a great item. We'll look to do that.
Thank you. Anyone else? With that, we will adjourn the meeting.